August 12/16. A crumbling little chapel on the edge of Assisi, so small that barely 12 people could stand inside it. Francis has been on his knees for hours. Outside, his friars wait, afraid to go in and afraid to leave. That night he asked the Lord for something, a specific grace for one specific day of the year, something no one had ever asked for before, that anyone who walked into that chapel on August the 2nd, having confessed and received communion, would receive the complete forgiveness of every penalty owed for their sins, full and entire. No money required, no long pilgrimage, no months of fasting. Just walk in, just ask. Pope Honorius III heard the request and said that nothing like it had ever been asked in the history of the Church. The cardinals looked at the Pope. The Pope looked at Francis. Francis didn't move from the floor. It was granted. That happened on an August 2nd. And what Francis won that night didn't expire when he did. It's still standing, still available for you, for your mother, for the child you buried too soon, for the one you've been praying for so long, you're not sure your prayers still reach that far. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this. She prayed around that date. In her writings, she laid out in real detail what happens on the other side when that grace reaches a soul that has been waiting a long time. What she wrote is what I want to tell you today. Write down below in the comments who you're going to use August section for, because everything that follows is about him or about her and about what you can do for them this coming August 2nd. The little chapel was called Santa Maria degli Angeli, Saint Mary of the Angels. It stood in the valley beneath Mount Subasio, between Assisi and the Umbrian Plain. When Francis found it in the early 13th century, the roof had caved in and moss covered the walls. The Benedictines had abandoned it long before. No one claimed it. It was a place with no owner, slowly being swallowed by weeds. Francis looked at it and knew it was his place. Something about that spot stopped him cold. The men with him that afternoon said later that he stood in the doorway far longer than he normally took to decide anything. Francis was a man of quick decisions and sudden movements, not long silences in front of a door. But there he stood, looking at the walls, the broken roof, the light coming in where it shouldn't. He asked the Benedictines of Mount Subasio to give it to him. They agreed on one condition. Every year, as a sign that the land was still theirs, the Franciscan friars would deliver them a basket of fish from the Tessio River. Francis accepted without haggling. It was the humblest rent anyone could put on a piece of land, a rent paid in fish. And that was exactly why he liked it. He rebuilt it with his own hands, with the hands of his brothers, stone by stone, with no architect and no plans, measured by nothing but the eye of a man who had given up everything except God. It took weeks. They hauled the stones from the river. They packed them together with mud. What came out of it was a chapel any builder of the time would have called temporary. To Francis it was permanent, because it was made from what was there, which was always what he preferred. When they finished, the chapel measured about 30 feet long and 13 feet wide. 12 people could stand in it, 13 if one of them was small. They called it the Portiuncula, Portiuncula in Latin, the little portion, the small piece. The people of the valley gave it that name, not Francis, but he took it without objection. It said everything about what Francis thought of the place he loved more than any other on earth. He lived there. He prayed there. Years later, he died there, asking to be laid on the bare dirt floor before the end came, because he wanted death to find him in the smallest place he knew. But before he died, something happened inside that chapel that changed the history of the Church. It was the summer of 1216. Francis had spent days in deep prayer, the kind that's hard to describe from the outside, because all anyone watching sees is a motionless man with his eyes closed, while what's happening inside him is something else entirely. His biographers, Thomas of Celano among them, tell of a night when, praying inside the Portiuncula, he had a vision. Christ and the Virgin Mary, surrounded by a multitude of angels, present inside that chapel no bigger than a poor family's single room. The friars nearby described a light that could be seen from outside. Several came to the door and didn't dare walk in. And in the middle of that presence, Francis asked for something. What he asked for wasn't for himself. He asked for a grace for everyone who would ever walk into that church. An indulgence. But not the kind people earned by making the long pilgrimage to Rome or the Holy Land after years of preparation and enough money to make the trip. He asked for something that had never been granted on these terms: that anyone who came to the Portiuncula on August 2nd, having received the sacrament of confession and Holy Communion, would receive the complete forgiveness of every penalty still owed for their sins. Not part of it, all of it. In the Church's tradition, that has a name, a Plenary Indulgence. And in the year 1216, that kind of grace belonged to the great pilgrimages, to the Crusaders, to those who spent years in penance. Francis was asking that anyone could reach it by simply walking into a chapel the size of a bedroom. He went to Pope Honorius III. The Pope listened, the cardinals listened, and the answer was that it was too much, that nothing like it had ever been done, that the Church had its own forms and its own measures, and what Francis was asking broke every proportion anyone knew. Francis pushed back. The cardinals proposed limiting it to once a year for 7 years, the way Rome's great indulgences worked. Francis said no. He wanted it every year, forever, every August 2nd, for anyone who came. The Pope looked at Francis. Francis didn't lower his eyes. Honorius III granted the indulgence. One of the cardinals in the room, visibly uneasy, asked out loud whether the Pope understood what he had just signed. Honorius III answered that he did, that what he had just given was enough, and that what Francis had won that day had no precedent in the history of the Christian Church. Francis walked out of that meeting on August 2nd, 1216, with something no one had ever brought back before. A single day of the year when the doors of mercy stood wide open for anyone, rich or poor, educated or unable to read a word, able to travel to Rome or unable to leave their village. A day for everyone. For the farmer in Umbria who had never set foot outside his own valley, and for the merchant in Florence who had spent his whole life sinning. The same for both of them, the same August 2nd, the same Portiuncula. And now comes the question we still haven't answered. What actually happens when that indulgence is applied not to the living, but to those who have already died? What happens on the other side, where your departed loved one is on that August 2nd, when someone here on earth offers that grace for their soul? There's something the Church has known for centuries that most people who go to Mass every Sunday couldn't explain to you if you stopped them at the door. Something that changes everything you can do for the ones you've lost. When you confess and the priest absolves you, the guilt disappears. Everyone knows that much. You walk out of confession and that debt to God is settled. But something else doesn't leave with the absolution: a mark. Sin leaves a mark on the soul even after the guilt is gone. Like burning your hand and having it heal, the hand mends, but the skin takes time to become what it was. No one blames you anymore for the burn, but the tissue still needs time. That mark is what's called temporal punishment, and if you die without having fully repaired it, Purgatory is where you finish the work. A place of love, of waiting, of the cleansing the soul itself needs before it can stand in front of God with nothing lacking. The souls in Purgatory already know they're going to heaven. What they're waiting for is the moment they'll be ready. Francis understood this at a depth few of his contemporaries reached, a depth that came from living close to the gospel. And what he asked Pope Honorius III for was a key to that process, a grace that could reach straight into that outstanding debt and cancel it entirely for anyone who met the conditions on that August 2nd. That's what a plenary indulgence is. In 1216, that kind of grace was reserved for the biggest undertakings a person could make. Years-long pilgrimages to Santiago or the Holy Land, joining the Crusade, Rome's Jubilee, which came only once every so many years and required traveling there in person. Francis was asking for it on behalf of a mud chapel outside Assisi, open to the poorest farmer in Umbria, who had never left his village and never would afford a trip to Rome. No money, no title, no years on the road behind him. Just walking into that chapel on August the 2nd with his sacraments in order. The cardinals understood exactly what he was asking. That's why their faces showed they couldn't believe what they were hearing. A couple of them objected out loud. The Pope signed. What Honorius III signed in 1216 still holds today. Every August 2nd, in any parish church in the world, in any Franciscan church. There are 4 conditions: a recent confession, communion that day, a visit to a church with prayer offered there, and an Our Father and a Hail Mary for the Holy Father's intentions. Nothing more is required. No money changes hands. No great distance to cover if you have a parish nearby. Francis made sure of that. He wanted no excuse for anyone to be left without that grace. Now here's the thing. What Francis won that day can be used by the living. You can earn it for yourself, but it can also be offered on behalf of someone who has already died. The Church calls this a suffrage. Whoever earns an indulgence can place it in God's hands and ask Him to apply it to a specific soul in purgatory. It isn't imposed on that soul from outside, since souls in purgatory rest entirely in God's hands, and only He decides how and when His grace acts. But it's offered, it's asked for, and God hears that request. Saint Teresa of Jesus writes about this in the book of her life, with a conviction that comes from having seen it, not from having studied it in a theology textbook. She saw souls in purgatory. She spoke with them in what she describes as an imaginative vision, a state where the soul receives things with a clarity that often left her trembling. She felt the weight of what they were asking for. A priest close to her circle died and appeared to her, asking her to pray for him, to do something for his release. Saint Teresa prayed. She requested masses. She offered suffrages. And in her writings, she records that something changed, that the soul found what it needed. What she describes is that when the suffrage of the living reaches a soul that has been waiting, that soul perceives it, it receives it. The love binding those who have died to those of us still here is one of the channels God uses to act. And when that love arrives together with the grace of a sacrament, an indulgence earned with the sacraments in order and offered with a clear intention, what reaches the other side carries a weight Saint Teresa describes as out of all proportion to the effort it took to earn it. One afternoon in church, 4 conditions met, and on the other side something that soul had been waiting for. Your mother, your son, your husband. That name you've carried inside for months or for years, that surfaces in your mind at the strangest moments, while you're doing the dishes, driving somewhere, waking up at 3 in the morning when the silence weighs too much. That person who died, the one you prayed hard for at the beginning, but who you sometimes feel time is quietly erasing, whose memory the busyness of life keeps pulling you further from, with a little more distance every day that passes. On August 2nd, there's an instrument the Church put directly into your hands for exactly this. Francis won it 8 centuries ago. It's still there. It's been there this whole time. And the question that's still unanswered is why Saint Teresa of Jesus, a Carmelite from Avila, had so much to say about a Grace Francis of Assisi, one inside a chapel in Umbria. What connected the two of them? What she knew about that day that her own sisters didn't? Saint Francis died in 1226. Saint Teresa of Jesus was born in 1515. Almost 3 centuries separate them, but that doesn't mean they never crossed paths in another way. When Saint Teresa of Jesus was a girl in Avila, the Franciscans had already been in Castile for generations. They had monasteries in Avila, in Salamanca, in Toledo, in Valladolid. They had churches the townspeople used for confession and for hearing sermons. They were known for an austerity that stirred up a mix of respect and something close to vertigo in anyone who watched them closely. Friars in brown habits, begging in the streets with a calm that didn't match the hunger they must have felt. The people knew them. The children of Avila knew them. Saint Teresa knew them from an early age, long before she understood who the man who had founded that order 3 centuries earlier had actually been. And once she started reading, and she started very young, and read a great deal as a child. The texts circulating through Castile's convents in the 16th century included works from the Franciscan tradition. Lives of saints, treatises on prayer, letters of spiritual direction passed from hand to hand. That spirituality was in the air, breathed inside Spain's cloisters at the time. It shaped her spiritual formation before she even had a name for it herself. But there's something more concrete than that. The man who most shaped Saint Teresa of Jesus during the hardest years of her interior life was a Franciscan. His name was Peter of Alcantara. He was Spanish, from Extremadura, and had pushed the Franciscan reform to a degree that unsettled even his own brothers in habit. He slept an hour and a half a night. He had done it for decades. His cell measured about 5 feet, just long enough to lie down with his knees drawn in. He wore a habit of coarse sackcloth so rough that, as Saint Teresa recounts in the book of her life, seeing it up close left an impression that didn't fade easily. She describes him with a kind of restrained wonder, like someone trying to convey something she knows she'll never fully manage to convey. He had reduced his life to the smallest thing it could be, and inside that smallness, he'd found something that radiated out of him when he spoke, when he stayed silent, simply by being in the same room as another person. Saint Teresa met him when he was already an old man, and she had spent years trapped in a spiritual life that left her unsatisfied without her quite knowing why. There were mystical experiences her confessors didn't know what to make of. Visions some told her came from God, and others told her came from the devil. Whole seasons when praying felt like pushing something heavy uphill. She lived in an uncertainty that wore her down and made her doubt herself so often that she herself calls it, in the book of her life, one of the worst sufferings she ever knew. Peter of Alcantara listened to her. Really listened, with the kind of attention only people who've spent years in silence carry with them, people who know what it costs to speak about the things that actually matter. And he told her that what she was experiencing came from God. That changed everything. Saint Teresa writes about it in the book of her life, with a gratitude that reaches across the centuries, one you can still feel even from 500 years away. She says no one before him had ever given her that certainty with that kind of clarity. That Peter of Alcantara understood in a single afternoon what other confessors hadn't understood in years of spiritual direction. A Franciscan, a man shaped by the same spiritual tradition as Francis of Assisi, the same tradition that had won the pardon of August 2nd 300 years before. That connection matters more than it might seem. It explains why Saint Teresa understood the grace of August 2nd with a depth that came from the inside, from years spent among people who carried that spirituality in their bones, who had inherited it from Francis and passed it on with the authority of people who live what they preach. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus and Francis of Assisi share underneath it all, beneath the different habits and the centuries between them, is a way of understanding purgatory that very few people have known how to put into words this concretely. For both of them, the souls there carry the temperature of love, a love that is still being completed. A soul in purgation wants to be ready. It wants to enter whole. And it waits for someone here to do something for it, because it can no longer do anything for itself. Saint Teresa describes this in several places throughout her writings, but there's a detail in the book of her life that gets overlooked. She doesn't move from theology toward experience. She goes the other way. She saw it first. She felt it first, in those visions she had, visions that left her with a certainty about the other side her confessors sometimes took a long time to accept. Only afterward did she go looking in theology for the language to explain what she'd received in prayer. That order matters. People who speak about purgatory from books and people who speak about it from having seen it don't sound the same. Saint Teresa doesn't sound like a theologian explaining purgatory. She sounds like someone who came close to something and still carries it with her. That waiting of souls is exactly what the Pardon of Assisi comes to interrupt every August the 2nd. And what Saint Teresa saw about what happens in that moment, about how that grace reaches a soul that's been waiting, is what we still haven't told you. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa describes the human soul as a castle made of diamond with many rooms inside it, 7 mansions, each one closer to the center than the last, and at the center, the king who fills everything. It's an image that's circulated for 5 centuries and still works because it says something reason alone can't say, that the soul has depth, that there are layers, that people who spend their whole lives in the outer rooms never come to know what's inside, and that what God places in the innermost rooms is a different nature entirely from anything the person had known on the surface. What Saint Teresa perceived about purgatory comes out of those interior rooms. Out of the deepest states of prayer she describes in the book of her life and in the interior castle, where the soul perceives things it later can't fully put into words, though it tries anyway because it feels it has to. There are moments in her writing where you can tell she's reaching for the exact language for something that exceeds language, that there's more than words can carry. And in those moments when you watch her search and not quite find it, that's when it's most obvious that what she's describing came from having been close to something real. One of those things is the speed of grace. In her own words, Saint Teresa writes in the book of her life that God can accomplish in a single moment what the soul on its own would take years to cover. She says this in the context of the favors she received in prayer. Those instants when the Lord drew her close to himself in a way no clock could measure. A single instant of that kind, she writes, was worth more than years of her own effort. The soul came out transformed. Something had shifted at a depth beneath will and reason. And what happened there wasn't something the soul produced through its own effort. It was received. That same logic applies to souls in purgatory. A grace arriving from the living, offered with love and with the sacraments in order, can shrink a path the soul was walking alone into something completed in far less time. Saint Teresa never uses those exact words about purgatory, but the logic she describes about grace is the same logic. And those who've studied her in depth, from Saint John of Avila to the Carmelite theologians of the 17th century, apply it exactly this way. What a soul would take on its own to work through in purgatory can be shortened when the living offer for it, with faith and with the tools the Church provides. Now, for that to happen on August 2nd, for the grace of the Pardon of Assisi to reach your departed loved one, there are conditions to meet. The same 4 since 12 or 16. The first, confession. A real sacramental confession, with an honest examination of conscience, real contrition, and the priest's absolution. It can be made a few days before August 2nd. If you confess on July 31st and reach August 2nd still in a state of grace, that condition is met. The Church allows a window of up to 20 days in some cases, especially for the sick or for people without easy access to a confessor. What matters is that it's a confession made in sincerity, not one of those rushed confessions where you walk in a hurry and walk out without having really thought through what you said. The second, communion. It must be received on August 2nd itself. The Eucharist is the heart of the whole thing. Without it, the other conditions aren't enough to earn the Plenary Indulgence. Mass on August 2nd, if you're able to attend, is the natural moment to receive it. The third, a visit to a church. There you pray an Our Father and the Creed. In many dioceses, that visit can be made any time from noon on August 1st through midnight on August 2nd. It's worth asking at your parish, since the exact window can vary by location and local custom. The fourth, a prayer for the Holy Father's intentions. One Our Father and one Hail Mary offered with that intention. The Church doesn't require you to know exactly what those intentions are at that particular moment. It's enough to be willing to offer it for whoever is leading the Church. 4 things, 1 morning, well spent. And here's something Saint Teresa underlines in the way of perfection with a clarity few people have matched. The heart you bring to each condition matters as much as meeting it. Going to confession for real, with everything honestly examined beforehand, with a genuine intention not to fall back into the same thing, opens a channel that a rushed, distracted confession leaves narrow by comparison. Receiving communion while thinking of the departed loved one you're about to offer it for that day, picturing their face, their name, the memory of how their voice sounded or how their clothes smelled. That changes what happens. Grace finds more room when the person seeking it comes with their hands genuinely open. Saint Teresa wrote in The Way of Perfection that some people pray for years and receive little because they pray with their lips while their soul is somewhere else entirely. And some people pray only briefly and receive a great deal because when they stand before God, they stand there whole. That difference, she says, God notices before we ever do. Francis made sure the grace of August 2nd was open to everyone, without exception, without any condition of wealth or title. Saint Teresa taught how to go looking for it in a way that lets it arrive whole. Your departed loved one deserves you showing up that day with everything you have. There's a question that's been open since the beginning, one you felt even if you never quite put it into words. What actually happens on the other side when the grace of August 2nd reaches your departed loved one? You already have the abstract theological answer. What's needed now is the concrete one. What happens in that moment? What the waiting soul feels when something reaches it from here. Saint Teresa describes it in the book of her life with an image that stays with you. She speaks of a soul in purgatory as someone in a dark place who suddenly feels a window open. Not a window that sets it free yet, necessarily. A window. Light comes through it. Something comes through that the soul recognizes even without fully being able to name it. The place it was in no longer holds the same weight it did before. Saint Teresa uses words like relief and clarity to describe what the soul receives in that moment. And she also uses a word few people would expect in this context: joy. Not the joy of celebration. The joy of someone who has been waiting a long time and sees something finally move. The soul in purgatory that receives a suffrage feels something close to that. A joy mixed with the waiting itself, with longing for what's coming, with the certainty that the distance still left has just gotten shorter. Saint Teresa saw this. She didn't deduce it from a theology manual. She saw it in prayer, in those states she describes in the book of her life, where the soul perceives realities beyond anything the body's eyes and ears can reach. And what she perceived about purgatory is that the suffrage of the living reaches the receiving soul with a presence that soul recognizes. It knows where it came from. It knows someone on earth thought of it that day, went to church, met the conditions, and offered all of it with that name carried in their heart. The soul receives it as something with a sender attached. That's the part almost no one mentions, the name. When someone earns the Pardon of Assisi on August 2nd and offers it for a departed loved one, the effectiveness of that suffrage grows when the intention is specific. When the soul it's offered for has a concrete name, a face, a story behind it. The Church doesn't require the name to be spoken aloud. it's enough to hold it in the intention. But Saint Teresa, in her spiritual letters and in her dealings with her confessors, makes clear that the specificity of the intention matters more than people tend to think. Praying for all the souls in purgatory is good. It's an act of charity the Church values highly. But praying for one soul in particular, carrying that name and that history in your heart while you meet each condition, carries a different weight, a density of love the general gesture doesn't have. Think about your departed loved one now, not as a category, as the person they were, the way they walked into a room, what they said to you when they saw you were having a hard time, the sound of their laugh if you can still hear it, the smell of their kitchen if they were the kind who cooked. That person, that's who August 2nd is for. There's something Saint Teresa teaches in the way of perfection about the prayer of petition that applies directly here. God listens more closely when the one asking knows clearly who they're asking for. Not because God needs the information, because someone who prays with that kind of precision is offering a more complete act of love than someone praying in general terms. And love, Saint Teresa writes in that book, is the oil that makes grace flow. August 2nd deserves more than a vague petition. It deserves a name. It deserves a face. It deserves the specific person you're going to use that day for. And when you do it, when you're standing in that church after communion, all 4 conditions met, and you offer the pardon of Assisi for your departed loved one, saying their name silently or under your breath, what's happening in that moment is something the Church has guaranteed for 8 centuries, that the petition arrives, that God receives it, that the grace Francis won that night inside the Portiuncula is being used for exactly what he asked it for those still waiting, for those who can no longer help themselves, for yours. Saint Teresa is very clear about this in the book of her life. Some people do the holiest things of their lives with a dry heart and an arid prayer, feeling nothing at all while they do them. The consolation you feel or don't feel is separate from the grace you receive. God takes what's offered in faith, even from someone distracted, tired, with a heavy head. What matters is that you went, that you met the conditions, that you carried your departed loved one's name in that intention with real love, even if you didn't feel anything special in the moment. But there's one more thing, one that Saint Teresa mentions in her writings and that most people who earn this indulgence overlook without ever noticing. One concrete action that finishes everything that came before it and changes the weight of what's offered. Something that costs almost nothing but that very few people stop to do on their way out of church that day. Let's look at that now. And once you see it, you'll understand why everything up to this point was only half of it. The action Saint Teresa describes, the one almost no one does on August 2nd, is this: giving thanks before leaving the church. It sounds simple, maybe too simple. And that's exactly what it is. But most people who go to church that day meet the conditions, offer the indulgence for their departed loved one, and walk back out to the street, stop right there. They leave satisfied that they've done something, relieved maybe, with a sense of having checked the box, and they go home. Saint Teresa writes in The Way of Perfection that there's an enormous difference between asking and thanking, that someone who asks for a grace, receives it, and then moves on without ever pausing to give thanks, is doing something with consequences for their spiritual life. Consequences that don't always show up right away, but that build up over time. That a person who learns to give thanks with the same intensity they used when asking is cultivating a disposition of soul that changes everything. That gratitude opens a space in the soul that petition alone doesn't open, because whoever gives thanks acknowledges that what they received came from outside themselves, that they didn't produce it, that it depended entirely on God's mercy. And that, Saint Teresa says, is exactly the posture God values most in His creatures. Applied to August 2nd, that means this: when you walk out of church after offering the pardon of Assisi for your departed loved one, Stop for a moment before moving on with your day. It doesn't need to be long, a minute, 2. You can stay seated in the pew a little longer. You can stop in the doorway. You can do it on the sidewalk, eyes closed, hand on your chest, and give thanks. Thanks that this exists and that the Church has kept it alive for 8 centuries. Thanks that your departed loved one just received it, even though you can't see it or confirm it. Thanks that you had the chance to do something real for someone you love, someone who can no longer do anything for themselves. That act of thanksgiving is the seal placed over everything else. That act of thanksgiving does something theology describes with real precision, something Saint Teresa lived with her whole intensity throughout her life. It opens the soul to receive more. Whoever gives thanks for what they've received becomes a wider vessel for what comes next. Gratitude isn't an afterthought tacked onto prayer. It's part of the prayer itself. And whoever offers their gratitude for their departed loved one in that specific moment on August 2nd is laying the final stone on something Francis started in 1216. There's another element in her writings, one that has to do with what happens after August 2nd in the days and weeks that follow. Saint Teresa teaches in the book of her life that prayer for the departed carries more strength when it's sustained than when it's a one-time event. One powerful suffrage on a single day, followed by months of silence, produces less than smaller suffrages offered steadily over time. The grace of August 2nd is plenary, complete in its own nature, but the love that carries it still holds weight afterward. Someone who uses that day for their departed loved one and then keeps praying for them, keeps offering small things throughout the year, keeps them present at Sunday Mass with a clear, explicit intention, is doing something continuous that the soul in purgatory receives as a presence that doesn't leave. The love doesn't end with the day ends. The love can keep going. Think about the person you love, the one you've been carrying in your heart since you started listening to this. When was the last time you offered something concrete for them? When was the last Mass you requested with their names spoken out loud to the sacristan, written down as a real intention, not just thought about on the walk to church and forgotten by the time you left? August 2nd is the strongest day of the year for that offering, but the love behind that day can outlast the day itself. Saint Teresa says it in her letters with a simplicity that still catches people off guard. That the death of someone we love doesn't end our relationship with them. It changes its shape. Those in purgatory are still ours. They're still waiting. They still feel it when someone on earth remembers them with love and with faith. And what's sent to them from here, the masses, the prayers, the suffrages, days like August 2nd used well, reaches them with a strength distance can't weaken. That's Saint Teresa's teaching about the departed, that they remain within reach, that love can go on acting on them even though they're no longer here, that whoever prays for their dead consistently with the tools the Church provides is doing something with real effects on the other side, effects they won't see in this life, but that will be waiting for them when they arrive there. On that August 2nd, in that church, with the 4 conditions met and that name carried in your heart, the distance between you and your departed loved one becomes smaller than loss made you believe it was. And what's left to tell is something Saint Teresa saw that very few people do. Something that closes the circle on what Francis won that night inside the Portiuncula. The most concrete thing of all, the simplest. The one thing no theology has ever managed to complicate, because its power lies exactly in the fact that anyone can do it. And the one thing that by her own account, heaven values most in someone who uses that day well. Something happens in purgatory on August the 2nd that Saint Teresa describes with an image spiritual literature has never quite matched in the centuries since. She says that when the suffrages of the living reach the souls waiting for them, those souls feel something we in this life would call recognition. They know someone remembered them. They know someone used that day for them. And in that moment, the weight they were carrying lightens in a way Saint Teresa compares to the difference between walking with something heavy on your back and walking without it. The destination is the same. The road continues. But the body, or whatever in purgatory does the work of a body, no longer weighs the same. Saint Teresa writes this plainly without the qualifiers someone would add if they'd only read about it in a book. She writes it the way someone describes something they saw, and what she saw, she repeats, in different places throughout her writing, in different words, always circling back to the same conviction, that the living and the dead are connected in a way death doesn't sever, that there's a thread. And both sides can pull on it. That's the image. And that image carries weight because it comes from someone who came close to that reality. Saint Teresa didn't build that description by reading treatises. She built it from the inside, from those states of prayer where the soul perceives what reason alone can't reach. On August 2nd, when you go to church with the 4 conditions met and offer Pardon of Assisi for your departed loved one, what Saint Teresa describes happens. Even if you don't feel it, even if you walk out under the same gray sky you walked in under, with no visible sign that anything happened, the person you carry in your heart receives it. A concrete grace, arriving with the weight of a sacrament, with Francis of Assisi's signature underneath it, with 8 centuries of the Church guaranteeing that the channel still works. It arrives with a sender and an address. It reaches her. It reaches him. Now, there's one more thing we haven't said about what happens that day. Something about what the soul in purgatory does with what it receives, how it responds, what comes after the moment the grace reaches where it's waiting. Saint Teresa describes in the book of her life that souls in purgatory can intercede for the living, that the communion between the living and the dead runs in both directions, that when the living offers suffrages for souls, those souls, grateful, in turn lift up petitions for the ones who remembered them, that something moves both ways at once. She lived this herself. She prayed for people who had died, and she felt that those people from the other side somehow answered back. She describes it in her spiritual accounts with the precision of someone recalling something that actually happened, with that particular difference in tone between what's invented and what's received. That changes how you understand what you're going to do on August 2nd. When you offer the Pardon of Assisi for your departed loved one, you're not only giving something to someone who can no longer help themselves, you're also setting something in motion that can move back toward you. The soul that just received that grace, that just learned someone on earth thought of them that day with love and with the sacraments in order, can intercede for you, for your family, for that situation you've been praying about for a long time that still hasn't changed. Souls in purgatory have a nearness to God that those of us still down here don't have. They're on their way to Him, getting closer all the time. Their intercession carries a particular weight that comes from where they are, from that closeness to God we don't have yet. The Church has always taught this. But few people think about it when they go to earn an indulgence for their departed loved ones. They go to give. And it's good to go and give. But Saint Teresa teaches that our relationship with the dead we love, lived through faith, can run in both directions, an exchange. Death changes the shape of that love, but the love keeps acting, finds different channels, arrives from both sides. On August 2nd, you might walk into church thinking you're going to give something to your departed loved one. And that's true. But Saint Teresa adds something that shifts the whole picture. You can also go knowing that this person, once they receive what you're bringing them, is going to do something with it. That they don't just sit there passively. That a soul receiving a grace as large as the Pardon of Assisi receives it with a gratitude that has consequences. That gratitude becomes intercession. That your departed loved one, from where they are, from a place where their closeness to God is already far greater than yours is right now, can ask for you, for what hurts you most, for what you've been waiting years to change, and that still hasn't changed. That's what Saint Teresa saw, a real exchange, both sides active, love moving in both directions at once, across the distance death put between you, a distance the grace of Augustus skin shrinks down to almost nothing. And what's left? The last piece, the thing that's been quietly pulsing under all of this from the start, is what Saint Teresa saw makes it all truly work. The simplest thing of all, something anyone can do, and the most decisive thing we've told you yet. What Saint Teresa saw that very few people do is this: saying the name of the departed out loud in that moment. Not just silently, out loud too. It can be barely a whisper, one that hardly moves your lips while your heart is already saying it, but out loud, with the full name if you remember it, with the name you two used with each other, with the nickname, if that's what made him him, what made her her, the name you said walking into the room where they were, and they'd look up. Saint Teresa teaches in The Way of Perfection that prayer spoken with the mouth carries something prayer only thought doesn't. The words carry weight. That when the soul puts on the tongue what it already carries in the heart, something is completed that before was only half done. That God hears the thought, yes, and hears it with the same attention He gives everything that comes from inside a creature. But the voice carries a density thought alone can't reach. Putting something into words is a different act from simply thinking it. It asks more of you. It commits you more. And that greater commitment, that decision to bring outward what was inside, is exactly what Saint Teresa describes as the gesture that completes the intention. Like when someone tells you out loud that they love you, you already knew it before they said it, but hearing it changes something anyway. Something in the body, something in the chest, something the thought alone never produced, even though it was the exact same thought. Applied to August 2nd, that means this: when you're standing in church after communion, holding the intention of offering the pardon of Assisi for your departed loved one, say their name. Quietly if there are people around, but say it. Put it into the air of that church. Let that chapel, that nave, that pew you're sitting in receive the sound of that name. Let the prayer you're offering for them carry the actual sound of who they are, attached to it. Don't let it be a generic prayer for the dead in general. Let it be for that person, with that name, in that moment, in that place where Francis, 8 centuries ago, made sure God's mercy would be there for anyone who came to ask for it. Saint Teresa describes it in her spiritual accounts as the gesture that completes the intention. The intention moves the grace. The name gives it direction. Together, she says, they form something like an arrow that already knows where it's going before it leaves the bow. That's what Saint Francis won that night inside the Portiuncula, on his knees on the bare dirt floor of a chapel the size of a single room. A grace open to everyone, to the wealthy and to those who have nothing, to those who can travel and to those who can't leave their own street. A mechanism the Church has kept for 8 centuries without losing a single one of the conditions Francis negotiated. One day of the year when the living can do something for their dead that no other day carries the same weight for. And what Saint Teresa added in her way of seeing things from the inside, from those states of prayer where the border between the visible and the invisible thinned almost to nothing, was this: that love is the oil that keeps everything else moving, that the 4 conditions open the door, that the name walks it through. But what pushes all of it, what makes the grace of the Pardon of Assisi reach your departed loved one's soul with its full force, is the love you offer it with. The Church guarantees the mechanism. Love guarantees that the mechanism arrives full. Some people go to church on August 2nd, meet the conditions, walk out, and carry on with their day. And that's good. They've done something real. But Saint Teresa, in The Way of Perfection, describes those who come to prayer in a hurry, and those who come with their hearts wide open and says God gives to both, but gives more to the second, that the soul's disposition is the size of the vessel. And whoever arrives on August the 2nd with their departed loved one's name on their lips, with their face carried in their heart, with the 4 conditions carefully met, and with the real love of someone who genuinely misses that person, is carrying a large vessel, one God fills. Think about your departed loved one once more, about who they were, about what you owe them if you owe them anything, about what they gave you if they gave you a great deal, about what you never got to say before they were gone, if there's something left unsaid because time ran out, or grief got in the way, or because no one expects that moment to come, and by the time it does, there's no time left. August 2nd doesn't undo any of that, but it offers something worth even more. The chance that, from where they are, that person receives your love turned into grace, into the greatest grace a single day of the year can give you, and feels it arrive. That's what Saint Francis won that night in August of 1216. That's what Saint Teresa saw happens when it's used well. And that's what you can do this August 2nd if you decide to use it, with their name on your lips, with their face in your heart, with the 4 conditions carefully met, and with the certainty that what you do that day, heaven doesn't forget. You made it this far. Thank you for staying. That already says something about you, about what you feel for the person you carry in your heart, about the kind of love that doesn't give up, even when the distance feels enormous and no one's watching you carry it. What you heard today is a real grace, available on a specific date, built by a man who knelt in front of the most powerful pope of his time and refused to get up until he had what he came for. For you, for yours, for those who are no longer here and are still waiting for someone on this side to do something for them. Saint Francis won that grace in August of 1216. Saint Teresa saw it work. She saw it in prayer, saw it in the visions that left her without words for hours, saw it in the relief of the souls who appeared to her asking for suffrage. And what she saw left her with a certainty she carried for the rest of her life, that the living and the dead are not truly separated, that there's a thread between the 2 sides, that the thread can be pulled, and that August the 2nd is one of the days of the year when pulling it does more than at any other moment. Now you know how. Confession, communion, a visit to church with the Our Father and the Creed, a prayer for the Holy Father's intentions, and your departed loved one's name on your lips quietly before you leave. That's all of it. That's what Francis negotiated. That's what the Church has kept for 8 centuries so you could use it today. And when you walk out of that church on August 2nd, stop for a moment before you carry on with your day. Close your eyes if you can, and give thanks. Thanks that this exists. Thanks that you got to learn it exists. Thanks that your departed loved one just received it, even though you can't see it, or confirm it, or feel it in your body. Faith doesn't need confirmation to be real. And what you did that day is real, even if the sky outside is exactly as gray as it was when you walked in. Saint Teresa wrote something in the way of perfection that has comforted people for centuries. People who love their dead and sometimes feel unsure what to do with that love. She wrote that prayer, born of love, reaches further than reason can measure, that it travels farther than the one praying can imagine, that it reaches places the eyes can't see and the feet can't walk to, and that God always receives it, even when the one offering it rises from their knees without having felt anything in particular while they prayed. Your prayer for your departed loved one on August 2nd reaches them. That's what Saint Teresa saw. That's what the Church guarantees. That's what Francis won, so that no one who loved their dead would be left without a way to reach where they are. There's one more thing I want to tell you before we finish. If you've been carrying the guilt of not having done more while that person was alive, if there's something you never got to say, something you didn't do in time, something that stayed unfinished and still weighs on you, August 2nd doesn't erase that. but it does something that might matter more. It gives you a way to keep acting, to keep being someone who does something for that person, even though they are gone, to stay in relationship with them, even if the relationship has changed shape. Saint Teresa understood this better than most. She lost people she loved too. Her mother when she was a child, so young that she describes the pain of that loss in the book of her life, with a clarity only someone who truly lived it could have. She writes that when her mother died, she went and knelt in front of an image of the Virgin Mary and asked her to be her mother from that moment on. She was 12 years old. That gesture, a 12-year-old girl who has just lost her mother asking the Virgin to fill that place, says everything about the kind of faith Saint Teresa carried for the rest of her life. A faith that looks for someone to turn to when the grief is too heavy to carry alone. She lost her father too, years later, and friars and nuns from her own convents who died before her. And every time someone close to her died, the first thing she did was pray, request masses, offer suffrages, use the tools the church gave her with an urgency her biographers describe as the urgency of someone who knows time matters, that what's done now has consequences on the other side, that love doesn't retire just because someone has died. That's the model she left us. Keep loving, keep acting, keep using what the church places in the hands of the living to reach the dead. August 2nd is your chance to do exactly that. And once you've done it, once you've walked out of that church with the 4 conditions met and your departed loved one's name still echoing somewhere in your chest, there's one last thing Saint Teresa would do in your place. Talk to them. Out loud if you're alone, silently if you're not, but talk to them. Tell them what you did. Tell them you thought of them, that you went, that you followed through, that you still love them, that the distance hasn't changed that. Saint Teresa writes in several letters about the practice of speaking to departed loved ones in prayer, of talking to them as if they could hear you, because according to what she saw and what the church teaches, they can. Souls in purgatory are in communion with the church. They're inside the body of Christ. They're walking the last stretch of the road, and that stretch brings them closer and closer to God. They remain ours. They remain within reach from here. Talk to your departed loved one that day. Say what you need to say, what you never got to say before, what you've already said 1,000 times, but that's worth saying again anyway. Love spoken doesn't run out. If anything, it's the opposite. And then let it go into God's hands. That's part of Saint Teresa too, that there's a moment in prayer when the soul has to let go. When the greatest love is the love that places the one you love into the hands of the one who can care for them better than you can. That offering and letting go are the 2 movements of love as it matures. She describes it in the interior castle with words that have echoed through Carmelite convents for centuries, and that sound as true today as the day she wrote them. That the soul which learns to release what it loves into God's hands discovers that God cares for it with more tenderness than the soul could ever have given on its own. That giving up control over what we love, when that release is an act of faith, produces a peace that holding on never produces. August the 2nd, offer it, and then let go. Leave it in God's hands. That's what Francis won that night inside the Portiuncula, a day when that movement carries more force than on any other day. A day for offering truly, with the sacraments, with the name, with a love that doesn't grow tired, and for letting go, truly, trusting that what you gave was received, that it arrived where it needed to arrive, that your departed loved one feels it even though you can't see it. Before you go, I want to ask you for something. If there's someone in your life who also carries a departed loved one in their heart, who also carries that name inside them and might not know August 2nd exists, tell them. It doesn't need to be a long explanation. Just say, on August 2nd, there's something you can do for your departed loved one. Look up the Pardon of Assisi. It could change that day for you. That gesture Passing on what you now know is also an act of love. Francis wanted this grace to reach everyone. He wanted no one left without it simply because they'd never heard of it. You just learned about it. You can keep passing it forward. There's a video waiting for you that picks up right where this one leaves off, about how Saint Teresa of Jesus understood the time between someone's death and their arrival in heaven, about what happens during that time, about what the living can do during that time, beyond just August 2nd. If what you heard today moved something in you, that video is going to move you even more. It's right there, waiting for you on your screen. May the Lord bless you and your departed loved one. May the grace of the Pardon of Assisi reach the person you carry in your heart. May Saint Teresa of Jesus, who saw with her own eyes what suffrage can do for waiting souls, intercede for you and for them before God. And may this August the 2nd not pass you by this year without you using it. With love.